A mechanic in Van Nuys looked at a 1973 Porsche 911 that Keanu Reeves had driven in through the shop door and told him, in front of 4 other customers, that the car was not worth his time, not worth the parts, not worth the labor. That the kindest thing anyone could do for a vehicle in that condition was let it go. He said it with the flat authority of a man who has been right about cars for a long time. He was wrong about this one. He was also wrong about the man standing next to it. There is a shop on Sepulveda Boulevard in Van Nuys, California, called Hartwell European. It occupies a converted bay facility behind a low stucco wall with a sign in dark green letters, the kind of sign that does not try to persuade you of anything. 4 service bays, a parts room along the back wall, an office with a glass window that looks out over the shop floor, and a waiting area with 4 chairs and a coffee machine that had been replaced twice since the shop opened in 1987. Hartwell European worked on German and Italian cars, Mercedes, BMW, Audi, the occasional Alfa Romeo, and Porsche, which made up roughly a third of all the work that came through the bays. The shop had a reputation. Not a loud one, the kind of reputation that accumulates over 30 years of doing the work correctly, charging what the work was worth, and not telling people things that weren't true. The walls held the evidence. Framed photographs going back to 1989. Raleigh cars. Track days, a faded snapshot of a silver 930 Turbo that had been restored from a rusted shell and won a regional concours 15 months later. Certificates from Bosch and from the Porsche factory training program. A hand-lettered board near the parts room that listed every major engine rebuild the shop had completed since 1994. 91 in all. Each entry in a different color marker. Some of the early ones already faded to near illegibility. People brought cars to Hartwell European because they trusted that the car would be understood. That was the word longtime customers used. Not fixed. Not serviced. Understood, Keanu Reeves had been working on the 1973 911 for 11 years. He had acquired it in pieces, not a figure of speech. The car had arrived on a flatbed from an estate sale in Ventura County, stripped to bare metal in some sections, missing the engine entirely. The interior reduced to aluminum floor pans and seat brackets. The man who sold it to him had been asking $18,000. He had accepted $14,000. He had been, at that point, 73 years old and not in a position to continue the restoration he had started and had not been able to finish. He had wanted, he told the estate lawyer, for the car to go to someone who would actually complete it. The lawyer had passed this on. It had been, in an odd way, a kind of audition. Keanu had spent the next 3 years locating the correct engine, a 2.4-liter flat 6, the right year, the right configuration. He found it in Düsseldorf, through a contact who dealt in air-cooled Porsches, and had it shipped over in a crate that took up most of his garage for 6 weeks while he prepared the bay. He rebuilt it himself, not with help, or with occasional guidance from a professional who did the hard parts. Himself, the machining was sent out. He was not equipped to do the machining, but the assembly, the timing, the headwork, the fuel system, his hands, his tools, his floor. This was not publicly known. It was simply a thing he had done in the hours that exist between other things, over the better part of a decade. The car ran well. He drove it on weekends when the weather was right, through the canyons north of the city, the way you drive a car you built yourself, with attention, because every sound tells you something, and you know what sounds are normal and what sounds mean stop. On a Saturday morning in late October, a sound had developed that was not normal. A rattle from the right side of the engine bay, intermittent. Low, the kind of sound that is easy to ignore and unwise to ignore. He drove it carefully down from the hills and brought it to Hartwell European because a friend who kept a 69 912 had recommended the shop twice in the past year, unprompted both times, which is the only kind of recommendation worth anything. He arrived at 9:15 in a gray t-shirt and worn canvas work pants with a tear at the left knee that had been there long enough to have stopped being a tear and become a feature. He had a baseball cap pulled low. He had driven over himself, alone, the 911 rumbling into the first available bay, because that is how you bring a car to a shop. You bring it. You do not send someone else to bring it. Gary Prentice had owned Hartwell European for 19 years. He had purchased it from the original owner, a German-born mechanic named Werner Hartfell, who had come to California in 1981 and built the shop through the kind of work that leaves no room for shortcuts. And he had kept the name. Because the name meant something in this part of the valley, and because he had earned it by continuing to do the work the way Werner had done it. He was 57 years old, 6 feet. Work-thickened hands with motor oil and the creases that never quite came entirely clean, the way hands look when they have been doing this long enough. He wore the same gray shop shirt every day, or one of 6 identical gray shop shirts, which amounted to the same thing. He had a quality that every customer noticed in the first 30 seconds and that veterans of his waiting room described in the same language. He knew what he was looking at. He would listen to you describe the sound or the feel or the behavior of a car for approximately 45 seconds, and then he would have an opinion about what was causing it, and the opinion was almost always correct. This quality had made him very good at his job. It had also made him impatient in a particular way, impatient with people who did not understand their own cars, who drove vehicles they could not describe and brought them in unable to say anything more useful than it makes a noise or something feels off. He had been patient about this for 19 years, and it had cost him something. He was less patient now than he had been. He believed this was wisdom. Most of his senior technicians believed it was something else and did not say so. He had grown up in Reseda, 3 miles from where the shop now stood. His father had worked the floor at a dealership in Canoga Park for 22 years and had been, in his own words, a parts number. Not a mechanic. A parts number. Interchangeable. Replaceable. Invisible to the customers who drove in asking for the service manager by name, and did not register that the man doing the actual work on their car was the one in the coveralls who never made eye contact and never expected anyone to thank him for it. His father had retired bitter. Gary had decided before he was 20 that he would rather own the place than spend 22 years being invisible in it. He had built something real. The shop was his. The reputation was his. When someone walked through the bay door with a car he had not seen before, he read it the way you read something you understand, quickly and with confidence, and he said what he saw. This was the thing that made him valuable, and the thing that on the Saturday morning in late October made him wrong in a way that a shop full of people would not forget. He was talking to a customer near Bay 2 when Keanu Reeves pulled the 911 in. He heard it before he saw it. The engine note was correct. Good compression. Smooth idle. Air-cooled flat 6 running the way a well-sorted flat 6 runs, a sound he had known for 30 years. The rattle was audible too, right side, intermittent. Something loose rather than something failing. He finished the sentence he was in the middle of and walked over. He looked at the car. He looked at the driver. The driver was in a gray t-shirt and canvas work pants and a baseball cap. He was leaning against the car with the easy, proprietary posture of someone who is comfortable where they are standing. He did not look like the people who usually brought 911s to Hartwell European. Gary Prentice made a decision in the space of about 3 seconds. Later, he would have difficulty articulating exactly what the decision was based on. Later, the articulation would matter. He walked toward the car. He circled the front. He crouched at the passenger quarter panel and looked at the seamwork. He stood. He looked at the driver. He said, "Where did you get this?" The driver said, "I've had it about 11 years. Who did the restoration?" "A beat." "I did." Gary looked at him. He looked at the car again. The bodywork, the panel gaps, the paint, which was correct Bahia red and had been applied with obvious care. He looked back at the driver. He said, not unkindly, but without softening it, "Look, I can tell you put work into this. But the subframe is going to need attention. The rockers have got surface issues that are going to get ahead of you if they haven't already. And whatever is going on in that engine bay, I can look at it. But parts for these are not easy to find, and labor on an air-cooled 911 is not cheap. If I were you, before we get into it, I'd think hard about whether the car is worth what it's going to cost you to get it right. That's the honest answer. Some cars make sense to save. Some don't." He said all of this in front of a man in his 60s, waiting near Bay 3 for a 5 Series that was being test-driven. In front of a woman on the phone near the waiting area whose E-Class had been in since Tuesday. In front of 2 of his own technicians who had stopped what they were doing when the 911 pulled in. Because a 1973 911 in running condition is the kind of thing that stops what you are doing. He said it with the authority of 19 years. He was done by the time he registered that the man he had said it to had not moved, had not gotten defensive, had not started explaining himself. He was just standing there next to the car with a calm that had weight to it. He said, quietly, "Can I show you something?" His name was Joel Ferreira. He was 26 years old, 2.5 years out of a trade program in Chatsworth that he had enrolled in because his father had told him he would need something practical to fall back on, and because he had already known, at 23, that the practical thing and the thing he wanted were the same thing. He was the youngest certified technician on Gary's floor, and the one who had been, in the 18 months since his hire, consistently given the jobs that required the most patience. Gary did not explain this. He simply assigned the jobs and watched what happened. What happened was that the jobs came back correct. Joel had heard the 911 before he saw it too. He had been under a 996 in Bay 4, and the sound of a good air-cooled engine entering the shop had pulled his attention in the way that certain sounds do when you have been listening for them long enough. He had rolled out from under the 996 and watched Gary's assessment and watched the man in the canvas work pants stand through it, without expression. When the man said, "Can I show you something?" Joel was close enough to hear it. Gary said, "Go ahead." The man walked to the front of the car. He reached under the front hood release. He opened the engine compartment, which on a 1973 911 is at the rear, and he stepped back without saying anything. Gary Prentice walked to the back of the car. He looked at the engine. It took him about 6 seconds. He looked up at the man in the canvas work pants. He said, "You built this." Not a question. Yes, Gary looked at the engine again. The assembly was immaculate, not showroom immaculate, not the immaculate of a car that has never been used, but the functional immaculate of a machine that has been built by someone who understood what they were doing and cared about every step of the doing. The cases were aligned correctly. The tinware was fitted correctly. The fuel lines were routed with the kind of attention to clearance and heat management that takes either a very long time to learn from books or a very short time to learn from someone who already knows. Joel had come around to look. The 2 other technicians had come around to look. The man in the 60s near Bay 3 had come around to look, because something was happening, and the people in the room could feel it. Gary Prentice straightened up. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Tell me about the rattle." They spent 40 minutes under the car. Not Gary and a technician while the customer waited in the plastic chair near the coffee machine. Gary and Joel and the customer, who lay on a creeper without being invited to, and had, within the first 4 minutes, demonstrated a fluency with the underside of a 1973 911 that made Joel revise, upward and rapidly, his estimate of who he was talking to. The rattle was a heat shield on the exhaust, a bracket that had developed a hairline crack where it met the collector. Minor, the kind of minor that is easy to find if you know where to look and have the car at the right angle. Joel found it. He showed the customer. The customer nodded and said he had suspected as much but had wanted a second opinion. Gary said he could have it sorted in an hour. He said it without the qualifier. Without the "but here's everything else that needs attention" before we get to the real problems. He said it the way he said it when the car deserved the clean answer. When they were back on their feet, Gary stood next to the 911 for a moment. The customer was wiping his hands on a shop rag that Joel had handed him, a gesture so natural that none of the technicians who were watching thought anything of it. Gary said, "How long did the engine take you?" "The rebuild?" "About 8 months. Spread out. I did it on weekends mostly." Gary nodded. "Where did you learn to do it?" The customer looked at him. He said, "I learned from doing it wrong first." He said it without irony, just the plain, factual way of someone describing the actual sequence of events. Gary was quiet for a moment. He said, "I owe you an apology. I made a judgment about the car without asking what I should have asked first. I've been doing this long enough to know better." The man looked at him. "The car told me what it was," he said. "You just needed a minute with it." Gary looked at the 911, at the engine he had looked at for 6 seconds and then been unable to stop thinking about since. He said, "It's a good engine." The man said, "It took long enough." Something shifted in the room. Not applause, this was a shop floor, not a dining room, and the people in it were not given to applause. But the man in his 60s near Bay 3 said, to no one in particular, that he had not seen a build like that outside of a concourse in 15 years. And one of the technicians, a man named Philip, who had been at Hartwell European for 12 years, and who Gary had never once heard volunteer an opinion that was not directly related to the task in front of him, said quietly that whoever built that engine knew what they were doing. Joel Ferreira stood near the back of the car and understood, without having to be told, that something had just happened in this shop that would take him a while to fully think through. He was not sure yet what it was. He thought it had something to do with the difference between what a person looks like and what a person knows. He thought it had something to do with which one you look at first. He pulled out the creeper and went back to work. The heat shield was replaced in 53 minutes. Gary did it himself, which he had not done with a repair this minor in several years. He did it because he wanted to. The engine note when the car pulled back out onto Sepulveda Boulevard was clean and even. No rattle. The Bahia Red disappeared into the Saturday morning traffic. Gary Prentice went into his office and sat down. He thought about what he had said in front of 4 customers and 2 of his own technicians. He thought about the 6 seconds between seeing the car and opening his mouth. He thought about his father in the coveralls at the Canoga Park dealership, invisible to the people who were supposed to be grateful for what he knew. He had spent 35 years trying to be the person who could not be dismissed, who knew enough that his judgment was the final word. And on a Saturday morning in October, he had used that authority to dismiss someone in 30 seconds, in front of witnesses, for reasons that had nothing to do with the car. He sat with that for a while. He did not find it comfortable. He called his senior technician, a woman named Raina, who had been on the floor at Hartwell European for 9 years and who had the quality, rare in any profession, of saying difficult things in ways that made the recipient more willing to think about them. He said, "I need to talk to you about something that happened this morning." She said, "I heard about it." He said, "I figured. Can you come by after close?" She came by after close. They sat in the office with the window looking out over the empty bays and talked for an hour and 15 minutes. What they talked about was what Gary had assumed about the man and why, and how many other times he might have made the same assumption about someone who hadn't had a 1973 911 engine build to prove him wrong. They talked about what the shop was and what it was supposed to be, and whether those two things were the same. Raina said something that Gary wrote down afterward, because it stayed with him. She said, "The car deserved the benefit of the doubt. The person deserved it more." Gary Prentice changed 3 things at Hartwell European in the 6 weeks after that morning. He changed them specifically and in writing, which is the only way changes at a shop actually take hold. The first, before any diagnostic opinion was delivered to a customer, the technician assigned to the vehicle had to ask 2 questions. What do you know about the car's history, and have you worked on it yourself? Not to gatekeep the diagnosis, to inform it. To get the knowledge that was standing right there in the room into the conversation where it belonged. The second, the staff meetings that had been monthly became bi-weekly, and one standing agenda item was added, a case from the shop floor where someone had made an assumption that turned out to be wrong, and what the correct assumption would have been, and how to close the gap. Gary presented the first case himself. It was from a Saturday morning in October. He told the whole story. The third, the board near the parts room, the one that listed every major engine rebuild since 1994. 91 entries in different colors, got a 90-second entry added. It was not attributed to any technician at the shop. Gary wrote it himself, in the space at the bottom. He wrote, 1973 911 2.4 flat 6, owner build. 8 months, completed at home. He wrote it because it deserved to be on the board. Joel Ferreira was the one who noticed it first. He stood in front of it for a moment on a Tuesday morning before his shift started. He read the entry. He read it again. He thought about the man on the creeper who had not needed to be invited, who had known exactly where to look, who had said, without any edge in it, that he had learned by doing it wrong first. He had been thinking, in the weeks since that morning, about what he wanted his career to look like in 20 years. He had ideas. He had been keeping them mostly to himself, because they were large ideas and he was 26, and he knew enough to know that large ideas at 26 look different at 36. But one of them was becoming more specific. He wanted to teach. Not full-time, not instead of the work. Alongside it, the Chatsworth program he had come through was one of 3 in the Valley, and all 3 were underfunded and short on working instructors who knew current vehicles at a deep enough level to prepare students for what they would actually encounter in the field. He had thought about this and then not thought about it, because the logistics were complicated and the time was hard to find. He started making calls in January. By March, he was teaching 1 evening a week at the Chatsworth program, an advanced diagnostics session for third-year students, 4 hours, using vehicles that shops in the area donated bay time on. The first session went long. He did not notice until a student pointed it out. He apologized. The students said they had not minded. He taught because of a Saturday morning in October. He did not say this directly. But when a student asked him once, in the last 10 minutes of a session, what the most important thing he had learned in his career was, he did not give the technical answer. He said, Don't look at the person before you look at the car. And when you look at the car, look long enough to actually see it. The student wrote it down. 2 years after that Saturday, in a long profile published in a magazine that covers restoration culture and the people who inhabit it, a writer asked the subject about the cars that had required the most of him over the years. He mentioned the 1973 911. He mentioned the rebuild, the 8 months, the flat 6, the machining sent out, and the assembly done himself. He said it was the project that had taught him that patience and a thing you love are a sufficient combination for most hard problems, if you give them enough time. He was not asked about the shop on Sepulveda Boulevard. He didn't mention it. The car, as of that writing, was still running. I keep coming back to the moment when Gary Prentice looked at the engine and said, "You built this," not a question, just a recognition, arriving 6 seconds too late to prevent what it might have prevented earlier. That is the part I think about. Not what he said before. Not the assumption, or the dismissal, or the authority it was delivered with. Those are the part of the story that is easy to recognize, because most of us have been on one side of it or the other, and usually we know which side we were on. The part I think about is the 6 seconds. How close the correction was to the original mistake. How little distance there was between the version of Gary Prentice who told a man his car wasn't worth fixing and the version of Gary Prentice who looked at what that man had built and could not look away from it. 6 seconds. It makes me think about how many other moments there are, in shops, in lobbies, in waiting rooms, in the first 30 seconds of any conversation, where the same thing is available. Where the evidence is right there and we have just not looked long enough to see it. I don't know if I always look long enough. I don't think most of us do. Maybe that is the thing to take from it. Not the story's ending. The ending is satisfying. But endings aren't the hard part. The hard part is the 6 seconds before them. This story is fictional, inspired by Keanu Reeves' well-known passion for motorcycles, cars, and the kind of deep mechanical knowledge that lives quietly in people who build things with their hands. Drop a comment and tell me what stayed with you, the moment you keep going back to. Share this with someone who might need to hear it today. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one. See you in the next one.